Okay, so welcome everyone. Today we're going to continue our study of the book In the Heart of the Earth. We're looking at chapter 3, and hopefully this will be a beneficial study to everyone. So chapter 3 looks at the timing of the spring feasts, and basically we're looking at the text of the book here, which is going to be revised a little bit in the future. But I'm not going to go through it all because there's a lot of material. So anything you see shaded like this is the points we're looking at, and we'll just skip over some of the rest. So the timing of Jesus' death and resurrection is closely connected to the spring feasts. Understanding Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the day of the Wave Sheaf offering will help determine the timing of his death and resurrection. The feasts appointed by God in the books of Moses were very important events in the lives of the Israelites. At specified times each spring and fall, they were required to assemble at Jerusalem for holy convocations or assemblies before God. While the timing of the start of the spring feast is beyond the topic of this book, we do want to understand the relationship between the different spring feasts as it needs to fit with the timing of Jesus' death and resurrection. The spring feasts in many ways foreshadowed the events of Jesus' first coming. And of course, fall feasts they foreshadow events at his second coming. So significant days connected with the spring feasts include selection of Passover lambs on Nisan 10th, preparation of the Passover on Nisan 14, and that's the day the lambs would be sacrificed. Feast of Unleavened Bread is 7 days from Nisan 15 to 21, and the Wave Sheaf offering. And that's one that is much disputed, and it's one that's not on a particular date. Okay, so it's not Nisan, a numbered day. It varies. And then Pentecost is 50 days inclusive from the day of the Wave Sheaf offering, and therefore on the same day of the week as the Wave Sheaf offering. So let's start with looking at the selection of the lambs. So Exodus 12:3, Judy.
Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household.
Okay. So take a lamb, and then verse 6 says, Paul?
Now you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight.
Okay, so they select the lamb on the 10th and they kill it on the 14th. Why? Why that 4-day interval? What was to happen in there?
They were to care for it.
Okay, for what purpose?
Fall in love with it a little bit.
Okay, to see it as a harmless, lovable little creature. And then, of course, the hard thing was when they would have to kill it on the 14th, but that was all necessary. So where it says, kill it in the evening, in is bane, evening is areb, and bane really means between. It's only translated as in one of its 32 uses. It really means an interval, a space between two events. And areb is evening, and the actual term, if you were to read in the evening in the Hebrew, would be hey arabim, something like that. And hey is really the definite article, the, and then the Hebrew word ayin resh bet means evening, and this is a yod mem, that's the suffix meaning plural. So it's really, you got the word between first, between the evenings. Okay, that's evening, and the yod mem makes it a plural. So between the evenings. So the whole reason for taking the lamb was to help them recognize the real Lamb of God, whom John the Baptist introduced later. So Elizabeth, if you could read John 1:29.
John seeth Jesus coming unto him, and saith, Behold, the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world. Hallelujah.
Yes. You can see I'm skipping quite a bit here, but yeah, so they were to kill it in the evening. Okay, so now the same verse that we read earlier, Exodus 12:6. Let's read that from Young's literal translation.
And it hath become a charge to you until the 14th day of this month, and the whole assembly of the company of Israel have slaughtered it between the evening.
Okay, so that's a more correct or literal translation. It's not in the evening, it's between the evenings.
What are the evening?
Oh,
We're going to get to that.
Okay.
Some versions have the phrase at the going down of the sun. And when is the sun going down?
When it goes
At
down.
noon.
Okay, it starts going down at noon, actually. That's right. Because at noon, it's the highest point in the sky and it's going down from there,
no.
right? Of course, the
Mhm.
sun sits descent in the sky at noon and continues going down until sunset. This is the time referred to as between the evenings. And this is from Joseph Good. He says, within the temple, the daylight hours were divided into quarters. The quarter between 12 noon and 3 p.m. was called a minor evening oblation, while that between 3 and 6 was called a major evening oblation. Therefore, between the evenings means between those two periods, or 3 p.m., middle of the afternoon. Of course, coinciding with Jesus' death on the cross.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep. The expression between the evenings, here I've got it, Ben ha-arabim, there, used for the Passover sacrifice, is also used as the time for the daily evening sacrifice. So Exodus 29:39.
The one lamb thou shalt offer in the morning, and the other lamb thou shalt offer at even.
So even as a word, you really have to look at the context to decide what it means. It can mean like sunset, it can mean middle of the afternoon. There's various, or even the early nighttime. So the at
Okay.
is the same original word as in the evening of Exodus 12:6. Yeah, this is the time, and Exodus 29:39 is describing the daily evening sacrifice, and it's between the evenings as well. Okay, Exodus 12:8.
Then they shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs they shall eat it.
Okay, we've just read Exodus 12:6. It's sacrificed between the evenings at 3 in the afternoon in preparation for the Passover. And then Exodus 12:8 says they shall eat that lamb that's been sacrificed at 3 p.m. They shall eat it in that night. So what night are they eating it? Like what would be the date on which they're eating that lamb, that Passover lamb?
Nisan 15.
Nisan 15, correct. Because it's sacrificed on the 14th, and at sunset, at the end of the 14th, it becomes the 15th.
And it becomes the night.
Yes, exactly.
So if they kill it at 3 o'clock, you've got to then get it ready to roast it. And
Exactly. That takes
takes a
some
while.
hours. Yeah, and prepare everything.
Mhm.
So people get really confused. You really have to sort out the timing here to get it right. So they're actually eating it on Nisan 15. Okay, let's go to Numbers 33:3. And I'm saying we'll see how important this is later, but very critical verse in sorting out the timing here. Numbers 33:3.
Parted from Ramses in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month, on the day after the Passover, the children of Israel went out with boldness in the sight of all the Egyptians.
Okay, thank you. You said the day after. King James says the morrow after. We'll see there's a big issue with all of that.
Mhm.
Okay, the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying to him, where wilt thou that we prepare for thee to eat the Passover? Okay, so to understand that, it's important to understand that by the time of Jesus, the term Feast of Unleavened Bread was sometimes used to refer to the whole period of 8 days, including the preparation done on the 14th. Okay, so the 14th was the day the lambs were sacrificed, and then the Feast of Unleavened Bread went from the 15th to the 21st. But they would start to refer to the whole period of 8 days as a unit. They would call it the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or even just call it the Passover. But we need to understand there's a difference between the sacrificing of the lambs on the 14th and the actual feast from the 15th to the 21st. So here's a statement from Josephus. Whence it is that in memory of the want we were then in, we keep a feast for 8 days, which is called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So he confirms that use of the term Feast of Unleavened Bread to include the whole 8 days.
How does that fit with Yeshua being offered up? He was offered up on the 14th day. Did he give up the ghost on the 14th day?
No, it was actually the 15th.
It would be the evening of the 15th.
Well, when he was offered up, when he died, it was in the afternoon, middle of the afternoon on the 15th.
Okay.
And
So during the first day of unleavened bread, then.
that's right. That's right. And that sounds really strange. Judy just kind of questioned it because everyone thinks, well, if the lambs were sacrificed on the 14th, then he must have died on the 14th as the Passover lamb. And in a sense, it's true that he should have, but he was rejected as the Passover lamb. Okay. And we will see as we go through today that he was definitely, there's no doubt that he died on the 15th. It's very obvious from scripture.
Well, they were keeping the Passover on the 14th of the evening, and that's the night he was taken all the way through, right?
He was taken on the 15th because the lambs were sacrificed in the afternoon of the 14th. At sunset, it becomes the 15th, right?
Okay.
Right.
Confused. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I got it.
Yeah, we'll see. I've got diagrams and things that'll help quite a bit.
All right, way to go.
Mark 14:12.
And the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover, his disciples said unto him, Where wilt thou that we go and prepare, that thou mayest eat the Passover?
So this, as long as you understand that the term first day of unleavened bread includes Nisan 14 all the way to 21, then you won't have a problem because the first day of unleavened bread is really the 15th. Okay, but they sacrificed lambs on the 14th. And that's very obvious. I'm sure I've got that verse in here from Exodus 12:6. Specifies that they would kill the lambs on the 14th. So what day, first day of unleavened bread, his disciples came and asked him that. What day would they have done that? What date would that have been?
14th.
The 14th, right, exactly. So it helps to clarify the timing of events to understand that Jesus kept the Passover a day before many of the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
He kept it on Thursday evening. On Thursday evening during the meal, Jesus said, Luke 22:15.
Then he said to them, With fervent desire I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer.
Okay. And there's parallel verses in other gospels to that. If Jesus said he's eating this Passover, then he was eating the Passover, right? Which should happen in the evening of the 15th, after the lamb was sacrificed on the 14th.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, John 18:28.
Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early morning. But they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover.
Okay, so Jesus ate the Passover the day before, the evening before he was taken captive and died the next day. On the day when he died, of course, this is talking about one of the trials he went through. They didn't want to go into the judgment hall because they had not yet eaten the Passover. So obviously they're going to eat it later, that evening, Friday evening.
It's so ironic that they didn't want to get defiled by going into the judgment hall, and yet they're killing somebody.
Yeah,
Right.
Passover lamb, actually.
Yeah, exactly.
So there was obviously a one-day difference in timing of Passover observance. They, in this verse, had not yet eaten of the Passover meal. Feast days were sometimes observed on different days by different groups due to a few different factors here. Difficulty in determining the new moons, because that depends on the visual observance of the new moon. Sectarian differences in belief, like the Pharisees and Sadducees were always fighting amongst each other, and they had different beliefs as to the timing of the spring feast. And adjustments for convenience. And we do that today with feasts, with our holidays, right? We'll observe a day instead of the actual date, we'll move it to a Monday or something to make a long weekend.
It's this weekend.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to look at
So he had to offer up his he had to, I guess everything would be according to time, right? The perfect time.
Yep.
So he was to be offered up on the, I thought the 14th day of the first month, he would be, that's when the Passover lamb was to be offered up. I guess that's what you're saying. So during that afternoon, they would slay the lamb. And I guess in the same sense that's maybe his offering began that same evening, that they actually apprehended him, right, and took him in that on the 14th, or the evening of the 15th. I guess after that, the 15th came in. Didn't he spend a whole day, back and forth between Herod and Caiaphas' temple and all that, in and out?
That was early on the 15th. But you're right. The lambs were sacrificed on the 14th, and in a sense, that's when he should have been sacrificed. It should have been him being sacrificed in the temple, we could say, instead of that lamb. But they had rejected him. Obviously, they rejected him as the Lamb of God. So they went ahead with their sacrifice, and he actually died on the 15th, a day later. And early that day, yes, he was shuttled back and forth between different trials and everything. We're going to look at some passages from the Synoptic Gospels in context to show that preparation for the Passover meal, as observed by Jesus and his disciples, happened the day before the crucifixion. For instance, Matthew 26:17, disciples came and asked him, where should we prepare for their to eat the Passover? This is the day before he died, obviously. Okay, let's read this one. This is good. Luke 22.
Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. And he sent Peter and John, saying, Go and prepare us the Passover, that we may eat. Where shall I eat the Passover with my disciples? And they made ready the Passover.
Okay, so the word
Hallelujah. So they celebrated it. They did celebrate it that night, because I've heard people say that they just did communion and did the wine and the bread. It sounds like they did the full Passover.
Well,
Is that
yes,
right?
it uses the word Passover, and Jesus said in a few verses about he talked about celebrating the Passover with them. So obviously it was a Passover celebration. Jesus himself said that. So
Okay.
in this verse, go and prepare us the Passover. Prepare us, the word hetoi meso, perhaps, means to make ready or prepare. So it's obvious from the verses above that the preparation referred to was that of Nisan 14, the day for killing and preparing the sacrifice and making ready the Passover meal.
Something from Evans.
Okay, Evans put in a comment here. Which is the first month that you are speaking about? Which calendar should we use? Please help me. Okay, so we're talking about the Hebrew months, and Nisan, or Abib is the other name for it, was the first month on the Hebrew feast calendar, because they did celebrate another feast or another start of the year in the fall, and that was for the agricultural calendar. Okay, so this is talking about Nisan. John 19:14.
Now it was the preparation day of the Passover, and about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, Behold, your king.
Okay, so this is the day of the crucifixion, and it says it was the preparation of the Passover. So we know that the disciples prepared the Passover, and Jesus ate the Passover before that. So this, the day before, and the evening before they actually observed it. So this is referring to the preparation of the Passover as observed by, like, I think it was the Sadducees. The Pharisees observed the same day Jesus did, and the Sadducees observed it a day later. Okay, this will explain it more down here. John refers to the day Jesus died as a preparation of the Passover, or the day on which the Passover sacrifice was done in preparation for the observance of the Passover meal that evening. An important point to realize is that the synoptics and the synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The synoptics reported the preparation of the Passover to be the day before the crucifixion, and John reported the Jews to be regarding the preparation of the Passover as the day of the crucifixion. Therefore, there would be the same one-day difference in reckoning of the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Okay, so these verses are talking about preparation of the Passover. Now we're going to look at some other verses that talk about preparation, and you'll see something very interesting here. Matthew 27:62.
On the next day, which followed the day of preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees gathered together to Pilate.
Okay, and then Mark 15:42. Elizabeth.
Okay. And now when the evening was come, but still before sunset, because it was a preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath.
Okay, and then Luke 23:54.
That day was the preparation, and the Sabbath drew near.
Okay, and then from John, Paul.
So there they laid Jesus because of the Jews' preparation day, for the tomb was nearby.
Since there was a one-day difference regarding which day was the start of the feast, but they all agree in the above verses, you can see Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all say the same thing, that this preparation day was the day Jesus died. Because they all agree in the above verses, it can only be that those verses refer to the preparation of a seventh-day Sabbath, on which they would certainly agree. They all knew which day was the Sabbath. So when they talk about the preparation here, they're talking about the preparation of the Sabbath, whereas up here, they're talking about the preparation for the Passover. And since these verses are talking about the day before he died, and these verses are talking about the day he died, and this was the preparation of the Sabbath, then this had to be Friday, and these verses had to be talking about Thursday. So this totally blows the Wednesday crucifixion theory out of the water. Okay, cannot be. This is an absolute proof of that.
So I'm just a little unclear. So they had Passover together. He had Passover with his disciples. Was that Friday night, the preparation day? And then I thought he was killed the next day. Is that correct? So he was killed not on the preparation day, but then the next day on Passover?
Well, let me just go over this diagram. I think this will help. Sound 14 was Thursday. The sound 15 was Friday. They came to him and they said, where do we prepare for Passover? They used this word, hetomezo. So
Okay.
preparing, I put S in here as the sacrifice of the Passover lambs. Then you've got sunset. It's now in the sound 15. LS here is Last Supper. So that's
Okay.
Thursday evening. The actual moment of Passover is at midnight, of course, because we're thinking back to, and this is a celebration, commemoration of the Passover in Egypt. And the Passover itself happened at midnight. So then, Passover, so he's taken captive in the Garden of Eden. He goes through the trials and everything. And then the crucifixion happens, or he dies at 3 o'clock on Friday, Nisan 15. And all of this, Nisan 15, is referred to by all four gospel writers as the preparation of the Sabbath, and the word is periskew. Different word than this, which is just to make ready, like make ready for the Passover. So I think that should make it clear there. Now, theoretically, he should have died on the 14th, but like I said, because of their rejection of him, he died on the 15th. And I would throw this in too. What Passover lamb ever decided on its own what day it would be sacrificed?
None.
Okay, none.
Mm.
And there's lots more that could be included in here, but we don't want to make it too complicated. But it's very significant that he was rejected and he died a day later. We'll see actually in the end, in the last chapter of the book, how this is probably the most significant revelation of God's character of love, of his willingness to allow man to have his own free will. I think this chart has helped quite a bit. So just to kind of summarize that and move on, hetoi meso refers to the day before the crucifixion. and paraskew refers to the next day, the day of the crucifixion. And paraskew refers to preparation for a seventh day Sabbath. Okay, so in Mark 15:42, it says, when the even was come, and even is from this Greek word opsios, translated as even, evening, in the evening. It can also mean late or kind of from 6 o'clock to the beginning of night. Their sunset would vary a little bit, not as much as it does here, of course. It could be anywhere from like 6 to 7 p.m. So even when you see that in the Bible, there's very much a word for which you have to consider the context. Okay, we're going to look at the wave sheaf offering. Matthew 27:52 and 53. That's Elizabeth.
And the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints which slept arose and came out of the graves after his resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared unto many. Wow.
Okay. Now, if you read this in more of the context, okay, so he died here, and at his death, the graves were opened. Okay. But then it says, the graves were opened. So when you read it in context, it's at his death. And many of the bodies of the saints which slept arose and came out of their graves after his resurrection. Okay. So the graves were opened at his death. After his resurrection, they went into the city and appeared unto many. This to me is an argument that the resurrection was very soon after sunset. Okay, so he died at 3 p.m. It took a while to get him down from the cross and prepare him for burial and close the tomb. I believe he actually was resurrected right at the start of the Sabbath rather than towards the morning, because it doesn't actually tell us at what time. But there had to be time for, after his resurrection, the saints to come out of their graves and appear to many. And I think the ones they were appearing to were probably maybe their own relatives, people they were close to in Jerusalem. So these people maybe had died not too long before. There would have had been time for them to, perhaps Jesus told them what to say. I don't know, but they appeared to many. So they appeared to this person, woke them up at night maybe and explained to them what really happened that day of the crucifixion. Because that next morning they were taken as the first fruits with Yeshua to heaven. Paul.
In Numbers 9:12, it reads, and this is part of the statutes of the Passover. It says, they shall leave it until morning, nor break one of its bones. According to all the statutes of the Passover, they shall keep it. And it also says pretty much the same thing in Deuteronomy 16:4. So that's what led me to believe that there was no way he was resurrected on a Sunday morning. Because if you follow the ordinance, then he had to have been, resurrected a lot sooner.
Right.
Yeah.
Good. They shall leave none of it until the morning. That's talking about the Passover lamb. Thank you, Paul.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. I didn't know that. That's new information for me.
That's somewhere in the study, but this is a 200-page study, so sometimes hard to find it. Okay. So we're looking more at this wave sheaf. So Leviticus 23:11.
He shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted on your behalf. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it.
Okay, it says on that read on the day after the Sabbath, and the King James, it's the morrow after the Sabbath. So the morrow after which Sabbath? The meaning of the morrow after is critical to correctly understanding the timing of the resurrection. So it's a very, very important word, and we're going to look at it. Morrow is translated from the Hebrew word mokaroth, and the Sabbath is translated from Shabbat. But there is no single word in the original Hebrew for those verses which could be translated into the word after. So the word after, or after the seventh day Sabbath, that word is supplied. Okay, it's not there. So the Hebrew word for after is never included in the Hebrew for the phrase after the Sabbath in the King James Version, except in this verse, Nehemiah 13:19. And it came to pass that when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath, I commanded that the gates should be shut and charged that they should not be opened till after the Sabbath. And some of my servants set out at the gates that there should be no burden brought in on the Sabbath day. So why did Nehemiah command this?
Because people were coming in and out of the gates on Sabbath and selling stuff.
They were conducting business. They
They were
didn't want
conducting
that.
business.
So of course he would not
Um,
open it till after the Sabbath. Okay, that's the only time after is legitimately in the original there, and it's the word akar. So it was used in Nehemiah to indicate a time beyond the Sabbath. Okay, so here is another very important verse to understand what's going on here. Numbers 33:3.
He departed from Ramses in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month, on the day after the Passover. The children of Israel went out with boldness in the sight of all the Egyptians.
Okay, and here's where you have to really look at the context to understand what the word Passover is referring to. But the way it's written with that semicolon there, it's kind of saying the same thing twice. They departed on the 15th day, and they departed on the morrow after the Passover. So Israel went out, or they departed, saying the same thing. And you could say that the 15th day, they departed on the 15th day on the morrow after the Passover. So clearly they departed both on the 15th day and on the morrow after the Passover, both times being given in the same verse to describe their departure. So the daylight hours of the 15th day equals the morrow after the Passover. It can only be that the morrow of the Passover is equivalent to the daylight hours following the Passover observance and still on the same calendar day, Nisan 15, and the calendar day being sunset to sunset. So it's on the 15th, not the 16th. So this then is a more correct translation. Numbers 33:3 from the Young's Literal.
And they journeyed from Ramses in the first month on the 15th day of the first month. On the morrow of the Passover have the sons of Israel gone out with a high hand before the eyes of all the Egyptians.
I guess the high hand means they're waving goodbye. No, exactly, but
No, Paul's translation said something different.
oh, what did it say?
With boldness.
Boldness.
Okay. Okay, here's a diagram that will really help with this. So you've got, we'll just go through the days here again. We've got Nisan 14, the lambs were sacrificed. Now we're talking about Israel leaving Egypt, right? They sacrificed, they roasted the lambs, they observed the Passover meal in that evening up before midnight, because at midnight was when the firstborn would be slain. Then they leave Egypt the next morning. Okay, so it says they departed from Ramses on the 15th day. So here's the 15th day, on the morrow after, and it's really of the Passover. Okay, because the Passover is here. It's the same calendar day. It's not the next day.
Hmm.
So any translations that say the next day, it's the morning following the observance of Passover. It's not the next day, as in the 16th. Okay.
Mhm.
They left here, they journeyed to Sukkot. That was their first stopping place. And I believe that at that point, in fact, it says the bones of Joseph were, I'll say, raised. But remember, Joseph made the Israelites promise to take him back to the promised land, take his bones back to the promised land. So this, taking Joseph's bones, and then they're going to take them to the promised land, is prefiguring Jesus' resurrection. Hopefully that becomes clear.
So they would have ate, they would have had that evening meal. They would have been hugging each other tight at midnight, falling asleep, probably having 4 or 5 hours rest. And then even before the daylight, they're all packing up to start leaving that land. And then as they're leaving, they're coming into daylight Is that how you would see it, Ray?
Yeah, pretty much. Whether they slept or not, we don't know. This was such an exciting night. They probably just went through the whole night.
They were supposed to eat it with their sandals on their feet and
Yes.
ready to go.
Yeah,
So
not lying down.
Yeah.
maybe the kids had a nap.
Yeah, maybe the kids had a nap. Okay, so that I'm saying is logically the only way to figure out the timing here, the order of events. But we can look at it down here. I'm calling this the incorrect timing. So it says they departed from Ramses. So verses that say the next day, meaning the next calendar day, would have them leaving the next calendar day after the Passover. Passover is here at midnight, would be the 16th. In that case, they eat their meal here. The Passover happens here. They've got sandals on their feet, staff in hand, ready to go. What are they doing all this time? It makes no sense
Mhm.
to have that big gap in there. Okay. The morrow of the Passover does not mean the day after, as in the next calendar day. What would be the purpose of having shoes on feet and staff in hand if they were not leaving for another approximately 30 hours? It is a daylight period following or next after the event of the Passover, where the death angel, you could say, passed over the houses. And that happened at midnight on Nisan 15. So the morrow after the Passover follows the Passover, which actually happened at midnight on the 15th of that month, when the Lord passed over the houses of the children of Israel. Since evening and morning constitute a full day, they departed on the same calendar day, still the 15th. It was both the morrow after the Passover and the morning of the calendar day in which the Passover occurred, or Passover morning, or the morrow of the Passover. In this case, we can be 100% sure the morrow after the Passover was on the 15th, because Numbers 33:3 explicitly gives that date, and we read that earlier. Okay, I just want to read that again to make sure we've got that. So Numbers 33:3 definitely says the 15th. And they departed from Ramses in the first month on the 15th day of the first month. Okay, there you've got it. You can't go wrong on that. Okay, so now we're going to look at some examples of the use of the word morrow, because this is critically important. Now, there's several passages of scripture that support what I'm saying here, but we won't go through them all. Well, let's look at this one. And the firstborn, this is firstborn of Lot's daughters, said unto the younger, Our father is old, and there is not a man in the earth to come in unto us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve seed of our father. And they made their father drink wine that night. And the firstborn went in and lay with her father, and he perceived not when she lay down or when she arose. And it came to pass on the morrow that the firstborn, this is the word mokaroth, that the firstborn said unto the younger, Behold, I lay yesternight with my father. Let us make him drink wine this night also, and thou go in and lie with him, that we may preserve seed of our father. So here's a diagram that helps with this. So on the morrow, that's what the verse says. On the morrow, she said. So on the morrow, the firstborn said, so that's here, I lay yesternight, referring to the previous night there, with my father. I put in here, Lot drinks wine, lots of it. Okay, he didn't know what was going on.
Mm.
So obviously in that case, Mokaroth came to pass on the morrow is not the next calendar day. It's the daylight following, I call it the reference point that they start from. So it is obvious from the context that the morrow, Mokaroth, was the following morning, not the next calendar day.
Mm.
The Quail in Exodus also shows it. We won't read them all. Oh, Paul, go ahead.
I was just going to say that in the old Webster's, morrow could mean morning.
Yes, you brought that to my attention not long ago. There's one of those dictionaries where he digs into the origins of those words. Okay, so here's another figure. So you've got Sabbath the 16th, preparation day the 15th. The fifth day is Nisan 14. So the disciples prepare the Passover. Jesus ate the Passover with them in the evening of the 15th. He is taken captive. He is crucified on the cross. He actually dies at 3 p.m. There's his burial, his resurrection, and this then is the morrow of the Sabbath. Okay, and this is when the wave offering would have happened. After his resurrection, he ascended briefly to heaven, if you remember. Okay, so in Leviticus 23, it talks about bringing a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest unto the priest. And it would be prepared and waved the next morning after they brought it. So I've got some things in here that will explain more about that. The beginning reference point in time here is when they brought the sheaf to the priest. The next period of wakefulness, the following morning, is when the sheaf was waved. As the word mokaroth itself indicates, the daylight time following the reference point, there is no need to add the word after, and it is not present in the Hebrew. However, the word mokaroth is understood to refer to the next or following period of wakefulness following, in this case, the bringing of the sheaf. Therefore, it is the morrow after the giving of the sheaf to the priest, which is the morrow or morning of the Sabbath. Okay, I'm going to read this from the Mishnah, written a few centuries after the time of the first century church, describes how a messenger would go out and bind the standing stalks of grain into sheaves so that they could be easily cut. The priest, followed by his entourage, would come to the field, sickle in hand, and ask, "Is the sun set?" To which the people would answer, "Yes." So obviously the sun had set at that point. "Shall I reap?" And they answer, "Reap." The priest then cut off a standing stalk of grain, then took it to be prepared for the offering the next morning. So they go and they tie a nice bundle together. It's still attached to the ground. In the afternoon, they cut it just after sunset, and then it's offered the next morning.
And you shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering. 7 Sabbaths shall be completed.
Okay, well, we'll go on and that'll make more sense. But this is pointing forward to 7 Sabbaths, and it's pointing forward to Pentecost. Okay, here's a diagram that should help with what I just said. So the sheaf is bound in the field, corresponding to Jesus being bound, nailed to the cross. The sheaf was harvested right after sunset, and that's when Jesus was resurrected. We could say he was harvested in a sense, but his harvest was not his death, it was his resurrection. Okay. And the sheaf was waved on the morrow of the Sabbath. And that is when Jesus was presented before his Father, which is what the wave sheaf is all about. You see this especially in Revelation chapter 5. There's a nice account of this. So here's something interesting. There's actually 2 ways given in Scripture to count to Pentecost. Now, this helps to show that it ends on the 7th day of Sabbath. Okay, Leviticus 23, 15, and 16. It says, "Ye shall count unto you from the morrow of the Sabbath." So we're saying that's not the day after, it is actually Sabbath morning. So you count from then. And it also says, "From the day you brought the sheaf of wave offering." So they're obviously referring to the same thing. And you're counting up to the morrow of, not after, the morrow of the 7th Sabbath. And that time period is going to be 50 days. So there's this way and this way specified to do the count. And of course, if they're both pointing towards Pentecost, they have to end on the same day. Now, I know this is going through it pretty quickly here, but so 2 methods to count: number 50 days and number 7 weeks. But there seems to be a problem with that, because 7 weeks times 7 days per week equals 49 days, and 49 days does not equal 50 days. Okay, they're ending, both ways to count are ending on Pentecost, so they must start one after the other, one on one day. And well, you start the count of 50 days before you start the count of 7 weeks, because that's only 49 days. Okay, so first consider the instruction given to number 50 days. This count started from the morrow of the Sabbath. They counted inclusively so that day 1 was a Sabbath and day 50 would also be a Sabbath. So it's going to look like this. They start with day one on the Sabbath, this day here.
Mhm.
50 days later, inclusive, you come to Pentecost. Okay, so it starts and ends on the Sabbath. Okay, and the second way to count is counting by weeks. Okay, so you've got 7 weeks ending on Pentecost, but you don't have 50 days, you only have 49 days. And that 49 days is 7 weeks of harvest. And of course, you don't harvest your grain on the Sabbath because you're not working that day. The harvest would start on the Sunday, the first day of the week. So you've got 7 weeks counting up to Pentecost, which ends on the Sabbath. So the count is both by 50 days and by 7 complete weeks with a different starting point. So they both end on the day of Pentecost. This is just kind of a summary of I've got a lot here, the different evidences showing that it's the morning of the Sabbath, not the next day. So here's a New Testament that points out the same thing. It was written in Greek, which is obviously different than the Hebrew. You get the same effect though.
Now, when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and went over the sea toward Capernaum. And it was already dark, and Yeshua had not come to them. On the following day, when the people who were standing on the other side of the sea saw that there was no other boat there except that one which his disciples had entered, and that Yeshua had not entered the boat with his disciples, but his disciples had gone away alone.
So the day following was the following morning, but also the same calendar day as when Jesus came into the boat. Because you know it says it was now dark. Okay, so it's now started a new day. And the next morning, it says the day following, but it's not the calendar day following, because the calendar day changes before now dark, changes at sunset. Okay. So it's not the next calendar day, it's the next morning. So the same thing happens, it's not the word Mokaroth, but the same principle happens in the New Testament. It says the day following, but it's really the morning following the darkness here. And here's some more literal translations of some of these important verses in Leviticus. There's a number of them, but we'll read this one from the Concordant Literal Old Testament.
Okay. He will wave the sheaf before Yahweh for acceptance on your behalf. From the morrow of the first Sabbath, the priest shall wave.
Okay, so it's the morrow of the first Sabbath, not the morrow after the first Sabbath. And there's more versions like that, different literal translations. So here's a question. Why not fixed dates for Wave Sheaf and Pentecost, like a day, like May 5th, say, or something like that? Every feast is on a fixed day of the month. Okay, Nisan 14, Nisan 15, 15th, 20th, 21st, etc. Day of the 7th month, that kind of thing, except Wave Sheaf and Pentecost. Why the difference? Setting the Wave Sheaf and thus Pentecost to a fixed day of the week could have a purpose in God's plan. Fixed day of the week, not fixed date of the month. While this is not proof in any way, it would seem very strange that the count would be arranged in such a way as to make the first day of the week, Sunday, the day when God especially pours out his Spirit on his people. We know that Sunday, more than any other day, is in competition with the Sabbath for significance. By fixing the start of the count to a seventh-day Sabbath, it could be assured that Pentecost, 50 days inclusive later, would also be on a seventh-day Sabbath, even if the number of days changed in some months. And we know between creation and now, there was a change in the calendar, because at creation, the calendar consisted of 360 days. Now it's 365 and a quarter. So I think God knew this, and he did this in such a way that Wave Sheaf on Pentecost would always fall on a particular day of the week. Otherwise, why not just have it on a fixed day of the month, like every other feast? Okay, and I've got a link here to a page on my other website that goes into that change of the calendar that happened at the time of King Hezekiah. There was actually something astronomical that happened that this Russian scientist goes into and describes what happened, that actually resulted in a change in the calendar. And of course, the Bible speaks of that too in the days of King Hezekiah. So we'll skip all that. Next time, we'll actually look at the chronology of Jesus last week and go into it in detail day by day. Paul?
There's a story in Joshua where the sun is stopped also. Could that have been something that affected it?
That affected the day length in that day. I don't understand that it changed the calendar. It just made that day a lot longer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I do talk about that further out here too. Anyway, you can look at that if you want. And of course, this whole book in the heart of the earth is available on my website. So a person can go in there and look at. Thank you for watching.